Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Michael from the Honest Youth Pastor, back again with another TikTok Tuesday, where we look at a TikTok that specifically deals with Christianity and kind of work through it and see where it's right, where it's wrong, and most importantly, provide you with resources to do your own research down in the description. Today, we are going to be looking at a TikTok that talks about Jesus and Paul and basically pits them against one another, saying that Paul was not a real apostle and Jesus actually spoke to his disciples about people like Paul coming in and corrupting the faith. So is this accurate? Is this not accurate? Like, how do we know? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to watch through this TikTok. And then because it's so long, we're not going to watch through the whole thing like we normally do. We're actually going to watch through it and then stop it and address the things as they come up. That way we can kind of deal with them as we go. So this video is not too long. We're not rewatching this TikTok over and over again. So with that being said, let's address her first claim, and we're going to start playing it now, and we'll stop it and kind of address her first claim that she makes.
I am fully convinced that if Christians spent more time studying the words of Jesus and scrutinizing the words of Paul, they would recognize Paul as one of the false prophets that Jesus warned against.
Okay, so this is important to stop it right here so we understand what her premise is. Her premise, starting out, everything that she's going to build her case upon is this foundation, that Paul is actually a false prophet, and Jesus warned against people like Paul, but specifically here we're dealing with Paul as a false prophet that Jesus warned against. Let's see, she actually is going to try to provide some sort of backing for this, but we'll discuss that after she brings it up.
He says that not everyone who calls on him will be saved, and that there will be people who come in his name that perform miracles and cast out demons that are actually false prophets and what he calls evildoers. And he stresses the fact that these evildoers will come along after he's gone to lead his people astray. So in comes Saul.
So here's the idea. So she's about to say, here comes in Saul of Tarsus. So the idea being is that Jesus says, hey, these people are going to come along with the sole idea of leading his people astray because they are evildoers. Now, she's immediately linking Paul with this idea of coming in and leading Jesus' people astray. Now, it's very important to understand that if you've never heard this concept before, it's not a new concept. In fact, we could go all the way back to Paul's letters. He's continually fighting against people that are telling the churches that have been planted, the people that have been converted to follow Christ. He's continually writing letters in defense of his apostleship. So this isn't new. This happened from day one. But as we move through history, what we're going to see is that this is a common thing specifically tied to Judaism. The Jews would have claimed that Paul was apostate. They would have claimed that he was teaching a false gospel, or not even a gospel, that he was just teaching false ideas. We also have Islam having this same basic idea. In fact, what you'll find is, and we have a couple debates below that are going to walk you kind of through this, and they're very interesting to listen to, because a lot of the points that she's going to bring up in this TikTok are the exact same points that Muslims would bring up in regards to Christianity as well. Specifically, that Paul kind of co-opted the following of Jesus. He changed everything. A lot of the verses that she's going to use, they would use as well. Those debates are incredibly helpful for not only unpacking this idea, but showing not only the accusations, but also the defenses to those accusations. And I would highly encourage you to watch those below. But though she's not coming from that perspective, she's making the same sort of claims as those perspectives would make. That Paul's actually co-opting and changing and leading people astray from Jesus' initial movement. So let's keep going with that.
Tarsus, who was a Jewish leader of sorts who was persecuting and killing Christians. He has some kind of a supernatural experience that he claims he met Christ and becomes a preacher. But if you keep the words of Christ at the front of your mind while reading the words of Paul, Paul starts to look very suspicious. Paul says things like, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. Yet Jesus told his disciples to take up their own cross. He never tells his disciples that they will become Christ. But Paul seems to think that he is some sort of an embodiment of Christ by being crucified with him.
Okay, so a couple things here. One of her first sort of kind of hit toward Paul, the things that he's saying that's different than the teachings of Jesus, is that he's been crucified with Christ. It's no longer he that lives, but Christ in me, is what Paul would have said. So she leaves that part out. She's referring specifically to Galatians chapter 2, verse 20, and she's comparing that, or putting it alongside of Jesus' words in Matthew chapter 16, verses 24 through 26. Not recognizing, and again, I don't want to say that she's doing this on purpose. Maybe she's just not informed. Maybe she hasn't ever learned how to sort of read the Bible in context and what that means, as far as Galatians being a lot later on after Jesus' death and resurrection, as far as time events go. I'm not sure if she's been taught that or not. At the very end, actually, you're going to see she says that she's an atheist. So I don't know if she's always been an atheist. Maybe she grew up in the church and wasn't taught well and she became an atheist. Maybe she's been an atheist the whole time and just doesn't understand context, which would be hard for me to believe, but that's I'm going to give her the benefit of a doubt here, because when you read Galatians as well as Paul's writings in Romans, for example, they're not comparable to what Jesus is saying in 16. Paul's not saying, he's not doing the comparative that he's an embodiment of Christ. That's not what Paul doesn't even give the allusion to that. Rather, he's referring to the old man, the new man, right? The old man's dead. The new man is alive. It's being guided by Christ. He's been crucified. So the old man has been crucified with Christ, and now the new man lives. So the idea that these two verses or these two ideas are in opposition to one another just simply doesn't stick whenever you actually look at the context. Again, lots of things can be cleared up with context, and we're going to give her the benefit of a doubt here that she just doesn't understand context in regards to the chronological timeline of what's happened in Scripture.
Sharing in his sufferings, which I think it's very strange that Paul would compare his sufferings to the sufferings of Christ. Now, to add to the suspicion, Paul performed miracles. He cast out demons, just as Jesus said the false prophets would. And if that's not enough, consider the incident at Antioch in Galatians, where Paul talks about a dispute he has with Peter, Jesus' apostle. Now, we don't have much information about this dispute, and we're not really sure how it ended, but we do know that Paul thinks Peter was very wrong. Yet everyone there took Peter's side. And if you're a follower of Jesus, who are you going to trust? Peter, the one who followed Jesus and walked with him? Or Paul, a man who never even met Christ?
All right, so two things here. First, that whole event, this is why anytime anybody gives any sort of scriptural reference, you should actually go read that, because what she's doing is conflating what's occurring here. So the timeline is very important. I want to check my notes here because I don't want to get this wrong. So when we're talking about the specific times of what's happened here in Galatians, specifically Galatians 2, chapter 11, there are going to be 3 times specifically that you really want to keep an eye on as far as timeline of events. So Acts chapter 9, Paul and Peter have already met, and then we have this event in Galatians where Peter comes and he is only eating with the Jews. Whereas before that, all of the other people that were there before, or Peter actually was eating with the Gentiles as well until other people came, and then Peter just ate with the Jews. And this upsets Paul because Peter isn't being consistent. Peter is showing preference based upon who is there and who is around him, and Paul takes great offense to this. Now, what we can garner from this, and something she doesn't touch, is that this isn't an event in which is like destructive to Paul and Peter's relationship. In fact, we see them meet a few more times, and kind of all of these events sort of get worked out. I would read Acts chapter 15 and Acts chapter 21. Both of these are very important events as far as the early church goes, as far as Paul interacting with the disciples, specifically Peter and James. These are important events to see the timeline. So we basically have Acts chapter 9 occurs. Peter and Paul meet in Jerusalem. Shortly after this, this event in Galatians seems to occur timeline-wise. Again, we're going to have 2 links down there in the descriptions that are going to show you the timelines of events in Acts, and then a very much more breakdown of sort of the Peter-Paul incident, in which you can kind of see the different chapters and sort of how that lines up in a really detailed way. You can check that out below. But what we do know as far as the timeline of events, the other things that happen in Acts, this isn't something in which Peter and Paul's relationship is totally destroyed and they just don't talk anymore. And the disciples, the ones that walked with Jesus, the big point that she's making here is that they walked with Jesus. Paul didn't. they don't write him off. In fact, we can see specifically in Acts chapter 15 and Acts chapter 21, there are things that occur that actually show that they approve of what he's doing. They're actually sending him out to the Gentiles. There's a lot of details that are happening in both of these chapters in which give us a lot of information that demonstrate that they were actually co-signing what was happening. To go back briefly on a point she's already talked about as far as being crucified with Christ, she really used that as a point in which she's like, well, see, Paul doesn't understand what's happening. He's actually twisting the words of Jesus. We see the same thing. Peter says a very similar thing in 1 Peter, where are we at here? I'm sorry, I really want to make sure I get this right. In 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 13, as far as being crucified with Christ, that same language is used to demonstrate that Paul and Peter are actually on the same page in regards to what is occurring. Now, she doesn't bring it up here, but I do want to bring it up because I think it's important in this entire discussion as far as the disciples of Jesus and Paul actually being on the same mission, not working against each other, but actually doing the same thing as far as spreading the gospel. There's going to be an article and a couple of videos that are going to be talking about James and Peter specific, or James and Paul specifically, and as far as how those letters line up and how they actually work together. To demonstrate that they're addressing two separate different people, and James's letter isn't opposed to anything that Paul says in other of his writings. And that's important to note in this whole discussion, because what you're going to see in the debates as well, this whole thing is meant to undermine what Paul in his letters say. Because if you can undermine what Paul says in his letters, you can basically take the feet out of Christianity in regards to teaching and doctrine and things like that. Everything developed in the early church and the church planting movement that was led out for the Gentiles, that all goes away. And that's really the point, and this is where the connection comes with Islam and with atheism, is that if you can discredit Paul, which a lot of the quote super apostles and Judaizers were attempting to do in Paul's day, if you can if you can show that he doesn't have authority or he shouldn't be teaching, then that all goes away. So anyway, these articles below are going to show a coherency between all of them, and you can see just a timeline. The thing that happens that Paul writes about in Galatians, it's not an issue. Like it's actually, it ends, and we don't need to know how Peter and Paul worked that out, because we actually have in Acts chapter 15 and Acts chapter 21 showing that they're still working together for the furtherment of the gospel.
I'm an atheist. I don't trust any of it. But if I did trust the words of Jesus, if I did believe that Jesus did what he did and said what he said, I would not trust the words of Paul. And there are glaring contradictions between Paul's words and Christ's words when it came to spiritual doctrine. And I'll go over those in a part 2 later today.
Okay, so she's got a part 2 that she does. We're not actually going to look at that part 2 because you can go look it up if you'd like. Everything she mentions is basically the same thing that we've already seen before in regards to, she's saying that there's contradictions in which, if you actually look at them within context, within the chronological line of what's occurring in Scripture, as well as what James writes in his letter, as far as what Peter writes in his letters, we can see that there is actually a consistency with Paul as well as the 12 or the disciples that walked with Jesus and what they're teaching as well. The important thing to note in this video specifically is this is not a new claim, right? It's not a new claim to say that Paul wasn't actually an apostle of Jesus. It's not a new claim to say that Paul never met Jesus. It's not a new claim to try to discredit Paul, because Islam knows if you discredit Paul, atheism knows if you discredit Paul, that a huge part of the New Testament just goes away. The teachings and the discipleship and the theology that is contained within all of those letters that Paul wrote, that goes away as well. But the interesting thing in this debate, when they're talking about Paul and Jesus and how they're basically opposed to one another, it doesn't take into account the fact that James is actually saying very similar things to what Paul is saying. It doesn't take into account that all of Hebrews is actually echoing the same thing, the teachings that Paul teaches elsewhere as well, that they're actually coherent and consistent. In fact, the author of Hebrews actually mentions Timothy, which shows that there are connections between this writer of Hebrews and Paul and his connection there with Timothy, and that sort of showing in the letter as well. The last thing I'll say about this, because I still want to keep this video short, is that it's interesting that this is all coming up now again, even though throughout church history, if you see it, there was never, though this was always sort of here and it comes up every once in a while, it never gains ground, because the further back you go in church history, the more you'll see that there wasn't an issue here. They understood that the apostles, as well as Paul, were working toward the same goal of preaching the gospel and going out and spreading the good news to the world. Some were specifically going to the Jewish community, and others, Paul specifically, was going to the Gentile community with the same end goal in mind. Now, if you want to see if any of these resources, you can check out the links below. There are hours worth of resources down there as far as debates or talks in which this entire subject is going to be covered. You're going to see the accusations, and then you're going to see the rebuttals to those accusations. There's also going to be timelines, so you can see kind of how all of these events played out and when they played out, because that's important as well, instead of just throwing up things saying, well, they fought here. Well, okay, where was that in the line of time? Where did this all happen? Those are all important things to know to build the case, to understand that Paul did not co-opt Jesus' gospel. In fact, he was going out with the consent of the apostles to preach the good news of Jesus Christ. Guys, thank you for watching. Thank you for following. If you find that helpful, make sure you like it, share it, comment, do all the cool things. I'll talk to you next Tuesday.